Jason Anderson, Aaron Dale Burkeen, Donald Clark, Stephen Curtis, Gordon Jones, Roy Wyatt Kemp, Carl Kleppinger, Blair Manuel, Dewey Rivette, Shane Roshto, Adam Weissey. 11 men working a night shift 50 miles off the coast of Louisiana on April 20, 2010. Not one of their bodies was ever recovered. Gordon Jones had arrived on the rig just the day before. He spoke to his pregnant wife about 10 minutes before the explosion. His son was born 3 weeks later. Dewey Rivette had been a driller for Transocean for 29 years. He was scheduled to fly home the very next morning. 5,000 feet beneath them, resting on the seabed, sat a stack of valves and steel rams as tall as a 5-story building. Somewhere inside it were 2 hardened steel blades built for one absolute purpose: cut through the drill pipe and shut the well if everything above went wrong. Everything above went wrong. Almost every account of that night says those blades never closed. The U.S. Chemical Safety Board, which spent 6 years investigating the wreckage, concluded otherwise. This video is built directly from the board's published report. Macondo was a well in Mississippi Canyon Block 252, sitting roughly a mile beneath the ocean floor and another 2.5 miles of solid rock. BP was the operator. BP designed the well and made the calls on how to finish it. Transocean owned the rig and employed most of the crew. Halliburton mixed and pumped the cement. 3 separate companies, 1 hole in the seabed, and a chain of decisions divided among them. By April 2010, the oil had been found. All that remained was to seal Macondo temporarily and move the rig to its next contract. But that work was running late and running expensive. Consider 3 specific choices made in the weeks leading up to that night. First, BP could hang a shorter liner and tie it back, giving the well multiple redundant barriers. Or, it could run a single continuous string of casing from the seabed all the way to the reservoir. Congressional investigators found that an internal BP review recommended against the single string, warning it would leave the seal assembly at the wellhead as the only barrier if the cement failed. BP ran the single string anyway. Investigators estimated the cost difference at roughly $7 to $10 million. Second, the centralizers. These collars hold the casing in the middle of the hole so cement can flow evenly all the way around it. Computer modeling called for 21 centralizers. Only 6 were used. Halliburton warned BP in writing of a severe gas flow risk at that number. A BP employee, in an email later published by a congressional committee, wrote about proceeding anyway. Who cares? It's done. End of story. We'll probably be fine. Third, the cement itself. Operators chose a nitrogen-foamed slurry, a lightweight mix full of tiny gas bubbles. Halliburton's own laboratory tests had indicated the design was unstable. Afterwards, BP's internal investigation concluded the foam likely suffered a nitrogen breakout, leaving the cement at the wrong density. There was a physical test that would have shown whether the cement had worked. It is called a cement bond log. It was never run. Late on April 20th, the crew moved to the next step, the negative pressure test. The logic behind it is not complicated. Heavy drilling mud in the well presses down on whatever is below. Swap some of that mud for lighter seawater, and the downward push drops away. If the cement underneath is sealing properly, nothing moves. If it has failed, oil and gas start climbing up the pipe. 2 gauges were watched. The drill pipe read 0, which looked like a pass. The kill line, a separate pipe plumbed into the exact same well, read about 1,400 pounds per square inch. 2 pipes tapping one well cannot disagree. Either an instrument was lying, or something was actively flowing. An explanation went around the rig that night, often called the bladder effect. It claimed the weight of mud above was squeezing a rubber element in the stack and pushing a false reading onto the kill line gauge. No such phenomenon exists in the physics of the system. According to reporting at the time, driller Dewey Rivette argued directly with a BP supervisor on the drill floor as the test was discussed. Federal prosecutors would later allege that BP's 2 well site leaders botched the test and disregarded abnormally high pressure readings. Those allegations were never tested at trial, for reasons covered shortly. The test was accepted. Mud kept coming out, seawater kept going in, and the hydrostatic pressure holding the reservoir down came off. Gas began moving up 13,000 feet of pipe, expanding rapidly as it rose. By the time anyone acted, mud was firing over the top of the derrick. The crew closed the annular preventer, a rubber seal designed to grip around the pipe. Hydrocarbons were moving through it fast enough to erode the rubber. Gas reached the engine room air intakes. Diesel engines burn methane easily and cannot be throttled on it. They ran away, causing the rig to lose main power in the seconds before the first explosion. Losing power mattered for a reason nobody on board had time to consider. Deep in the blowout preventer sat an automatic system meant to close the well by itself if the connection to the rig was severed. It needed its own electrical and hydraulic supply to function. The explosion took the surface out of the equation entirely. The reason the emergency system failed to save the rig is not the reason you have heard. It is documented in an official federal investigation report, and the page will appear on screen shortly. If you want more analysis built directly from primary source documents instead of secondary coverage, subscribe to the channel. The blowout preventer sat on the seabed for nearly 5 months while Macondo flowed unchecked. It was raised in September 2010 and taken under federal control to a NASA facility in Louisiana. DNV, a Norwegian certification body, ran the initial forensic examination and reported in March 2011. Investigators found bent drill pipe inside the stack and blades that had failed to make a clean cut. DNV concluded the pipe had been pushed off-center, preventing the ram from doing its job. That report shaped nearly everything written about the disaster for years. Congress then asked the Chemical Safety Board to conduct an independent investigation. The board is a small federal agency with no regulatory authority and no power to issue fines, which is precisely why its findings tend to state facts other bodies avoid. Its investigators tested components individually, re-examined the recovered hardware, and modeled the forces inside the stack minute by minute, rather than accepting the sequence others assumed. Publication came in 2 stages. Volumes 1 and 2 arrived in June 2014, followed by Volumes 3 and 4 in April 2016. Here the 2 examinations part company, and the disagreement is worth sitting with. DNV concluded the shear ram closed on pipe that was already buckled. Board investigators placed the firing much earlier than previously thought, on the night of the explosion itself, with the buckling occurring in the opening minutes rather than days later. Same wreckage. 2 federal standard forensic reports. Completely different conclusions about what the machine actually did. Volume 2 is the primary document this account rests on. Dr. Mary Beth Mulcahy oversaw the board's technical analysis. Her summary of the central finding was blunt. She stated that pipe buckling could occur even when a well is shut in and apparently in a safe, stable condition, that a drilling crew would be unlikely to detect it, and that it could render a blowout preventer completely inoperable in an emergency. Robert Kaluza and Donald Vidrine were BP's well site leaders on duty during the pressure test. Both were indicted in 2012 on manslaughter counts. A judge dismissed the seamen's manslaughter charges in December 2015, holding that an 1838 statute written for shipping accidents was never intended to apply to well site leaders. Prosecutors then dropped the involuntary manslaughter counts, stating they could not prove the case. Vidrine pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor Clean Water Act violation and received 10 months of probation in April 2016. He died the following year. Kaluza took his remaining charge to trial and was acquitted by a jury. Keith Jones, whose son Gordon died on the rig, stated outside the courthouse that no man would ever spend a single day behind bars for the 11 deaths. That statement remains accurate. Fire burned for 2 days. The Deepwater Horizon sank on April 22nd, taking the riser pipe down with it and tearing the well open at the seabed. Oil flowed for 87 days. It remains the largest offshore spill in United States history. 17 people were injured, close to 100 got off, 11 did not, and the device built for exactly this situation, sitting directly on top of the well, did not stop any of it. What the Chemical Safety Board found is not what almost any popular account of this disaster carries. There are 4 key parts to it. The first is that the blades closed. Earlier investigations concluded the blind shear ram either never activated or activated far too late to matter. After testing the components, the board concluded the ram likely did fire on the night of April 20th, days earlier than other reports had placed it. The second is that closing made things worse. The board's report states that the ram punctured the buckled off-center pipe, sending large additional volumes of oil and gas surging toward the surface. The final barrier on the seabed operated, failed to seal, and actually increased the flow. The third is the physical mechanism, which the industry had not accounted for. The board named it effective compression. When the pressure inside a pipe differs enormously from the pressure outside it, the pipe can bow sideways even while hanging in tension. It looks stable, but it is not, and it can happen when a well appears shut in and under control, which means the crew fighting to save that rig had no way of knowing the pipe had already moved out of the blade's reach. The fourth finding is the one that reframes everything. The board recorded that the blowout preventer lacked the capacity to reliably cut and seal the 6 5/8-inch drill pipe used during most of the drilling at Macondo, not because it was bent, not because it was off-center. Even sitting perfectly straight between the blades, that pipe could not be relied on to be cut. For most of the working life of that well, the emergency system on the seabed could not have done the one thing it existed to do. Nobody aboard knew, because nobody was ever required to demonstrate it. Two further items belong here. The board documented 2 separate instances of miswiring in the subsea control pods, along with 2 backup battery failures, all of which could have been identified before April 2010. Popular accounts mention a flat battery and a faulty valve. The miswiring is missing from them, and in Volume 1, in a footnote, sits a note that the surface cement plug was set at a depth 3 times the maximum then permitted by federal regulation. BP justified this deviation by referencing a piece of equipment called a lockdown sleeve. The National Commission's chief counsel challenged that justification, finding other means were available. A regulator granted the deviation anyway. The reasoning for it was disputed afterwards by another federal body, in a footnote where almost nobody looks. The board asked the American Petroleum Institute to revise API Standard 53, the industry rulebook for blowout prevention equipment, and to require real testing of the redundant control systems inside a stack. Reaction was mixed. The Institute responded that nothing in the report had not already been dealt with by industry and regulators. BP stated parts of the board's reasoning rested on flawed assumptions. Yet plenty did change. The Minerals Management Service was dissolved, and the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement took over drilling oversight. Operators formed the Marine Well Containment Company and pre-staged capping stacks, so a runaway well no longer waits months for equipment to be designed and built. New blowout preventers carry 2 sets of shear rams instead of 1, positioned to bring wandering pipe back to center before cutting. Onshore centers now watch rig data live, placing a second set of eyes outside the pressure of the drill floor. The board's own verdict on all of that is in Volumes 3 and 4, and it is not celebratory. Volume 4 concluded the framework remained inadequate for major accident prevention in offshore drilling, and that the Bureau was not fully empowered to accomplish its mission. Volume 3 noted audit findings suggesting some companies used their safety management programs to document compliance rather than to manage risk. It noted that BP's and Transocean's written policies at the time of the blowout would largely have satisfied the newer requirements without ever having been put into practice. Underneath that sits an idea worth naming, because it is the board's actual recommendation. A safety-critical element is a piece of equipment or a procedure whose failure either causes a major accident or removes your ability to stop one. The argument is that these should be identified explicitly, individually, and then continuously proven to work, rather than assumed to work because they were installed and inspected. A shear ram that cannot cut the pipe it guards is a safety-critical element nobody ever proved. Which brings us to a comparison the board draws in its overview. Macondo raised regulatory questions in the United States, much as the Piper Alpha disaster raised them in Britain in 1988. Piper Alpha killed 167 men in the North Sea. Lord Cullen's public inquiry reported in 1990, and Britain rebuilt its offshore regime around a requirement called the safety case. Before an installation operates, the operator has to write down its major hazards, show how each one is controlled, and submit that to a regulator who can reject it. The burden sits with the company to prove safety, rather than with an inspector to catch a breach. The United States watched that happen. 22 years later, no equivalent requirement existed in the Gulf of Mexico. A backup that has never been tested against the conditions it exists for is not a backup. It is an assumption, and an assumption is invisible. Nobody argues about it, nobody budgets for it, and nobody stands on a drill floor at midnight and wonders whether it is true. It simply sits there being believed by everyone whose life depends on it, until the night it is finally asked to work. The Chemical Safety Board's report is free and public, running to 4 volumes. The blades are in Volume 2. Every link is in the description below, and the page referenced on screen a moment ago is in Chapter 3. 11 names opened this video. Not one of them ever knew about the 4th finding. If you want the next analysis built directly from primary source documents, subscribe to the channel.